Step 1 is to stay stitch your yoke front neck edges. You're going to be stitching about a ½ inch from the center front all the way up to the shoulder seam. This is a permanent stitching that stays in the actual garment itself. This is to prevent any kind of stretching, especially on curved edges like the neck or the armhole. Do the same thing on the yoke neck piece on the other side, still starting from the center and stitching towards the shoulder seam. For step 2, you fold your neck bands in half, and you'll see that I'm doing this lengthwise. Make sure you've got the wrong sides together as opposed to the right sides together. This seems counterintuitive, but it'll make sense when we attach it to your yoke neck. Step 3 has you attaching the neck band pinned to your front neck yoke. You can see here that the pointed arrow end is facing downwards towards the center. If you're not sure where the center of your front neck yoke piece is, check back with your paper pattern to make sure that you're lined up. You may find that your band is a little bit shorter than your actual front neck yoke piece. If that's the case, don't worry, that's actually intentional. You'll be stretching the band to make sure you fit the neck edge. The band should have a little bit more flexibility because it's cut on the bias, the diagonal part of a fabric, and that usually has the most stretch. Grabbing my front piece so that I can make sure and line up the edges of my 2 front yokes with the edges of my front piece. This will also help me adjust how much needs to overlap before I pin. I'm putting 2 pins in right at the center front to make sure that I've got a secure basting stitch to keep these 2 pieces together. So I'll have one vertical between the 2, and then I'll have a horizontal piece to ensure security. To To create the basting stitch, you'll want to adjust the nozzle for the stitch length. We're starting off typically at 2 for your normal stitches, but for a basting stitch, since it's temporary, you want to keep it at 4. That just means that the stitch length will be longer, so it'll be easier to rip out. I've done a back stitch here, but actually for this non-permanent stitch, you really don't need to. So you can see up close, the stitch is a lot wider than the previous, more permanent stitches. And now I'm going to go over horizontal, just to reinforce. I want to make sure that I'm lining up this little stitch here right up on the edge of my foot, as opposed to doing a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. You'll need that seam allowance for later when you're stitching the top yoke to your front piece. Remember, we want to line up right sides to right sides. And this is what it'll look like when it's completely finished, but I'm pinning it upside down to show you that once I've stitched the seam, it'll flip up and create one entire finished front. I've done my lining up previously before I baste stitched the front, but you can see here once I put in a permanent stitch that the basting stitch won't be needed any longer to keep the front together. Don't forget to switch your dial back to 2 before you start stitching again. We want to make sure that this is a permanent stitch and not a temporary stitch we can easily rip out. Take my seam ripper and just rip out that temporary basting stitch that I left in from before. With the horizontal one, it's going to be completely in the seam, so it's not necessary that I take it out, but I figured I would take out both just for good measure. Then of course my last step is just to press everything. In this case, I'm going to press all of the extra seam allowance down, and that way it'll sit nice and flat. And again, I always press both sides so that way it looks nice and crisp. I'm yours.